Okay, and our reading today comes from Philippians 2, verses 12 and 13, and it is the New Revised Standard Version. Therefore, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed me, not only in my presence, but much more now in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who is at work in you, enabling you both to will and to work for his good pleasure. And may God bless us with the words that he's written.
So the question that we have been asking since Epiphany, on and off, has been, what does one have to do in order to develop a deep Christian spirituality? Now, last week we learned that the work of spirituality begins with letting go, which is harder than it sounds, right? Followed by an ongoing liberation of heart and mind and body. So, we also learned that we cannot accomplish this liberation through empty words or meaningless rituals. We do it through practice. That's why people say that they practice religion. You know, what else do? We practice religion. So here's where I need to make a little confession, okay? Because I've always avoided the word religion. I've shied away from it because to me, religion equated meaningless ritual and empty words. However, I've kind of changed my ways. My generation, we always used to say, well, we still say, oh, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. So you can just call me an SBNR. Now, SBNR is a label that people gravitated towards when a guy named Sven Erlandson wrote a book back in 2000 called Spiritual But Not Religious, SBNR, right? But even then, he was borrowing from a sociological term from the 1960s that was SBNA, which is spiritual but not affiliated. Either way, it's a quick, self-identifying way of saying, I'm into God, I'm just not into church. Which is sad, because as I have grown in my faith, I think that the church has a lot to offer when it comes to spiritual growth. So, last week I told you all about Richard Rohr. I am enjoying his book called Breathing Underwater. It is a fabulous book. And I credited him as the one who said that the work of spirituality involves the liberation of heart and mind and body. The liberation starts with letting go. What I didn't tell you is that Rohr also said surrender will always feel like dying, and yet it is necessary as a path to liberation. Now, I guess then we could say that surrender just isn't giving up or letting go, because according to Rohr, it's more like giving to, which, it's like giving to a moment or giving to a person or a situation which doesn't feel natural given our stubborn nature as human beings. We resist giving ourselves to anything. We resist surrendering to God. And you might be saying, whoa, wait a minute there, preacher. Isn't that the whole point of the Christian faith? Surrendering to Christ? Yes, that is the point. But even when we make a conscious, deliberate decision to follow Christ, it's hard to surrender. Because remember, I said that spirituality is work. See, our stubborn, self-defeating willfulness has to be converted and handed over. And let me tell you, it does not surrender easily, does it? If you don't believe me, hang out with a toddler for a couple of hours, right? Because, toddlers are so great. They're so cute. They're so adorable. They're funny. They're great, except when you have to say no, right? Because when you say no, you are telling them that they must surrender their will. And that does not come easily to toddlers. In fact, no often leads to Chernobyl-level meltdowns that all of a sudden they aren't so cute and cuddly anymore, right? But this kind of stubborn willfulness does not stop at the terrible twos. It's funny, our kids, it wasn't the terrible twos, it was the terrible threes. But as we, whatever it is, terrible twos, threes, fours, whatever, our willfulness just grows more sophisticated as we become adults, right? We find all sorts of creative ways to take and maintain control. And to complicate matters, the world rewards us for it. Because in the business world, if you don't take control, you aren't even respected, right? People who don't take control are seen as weak and ineffective in the business world. But, so when we perfect the art of taking control so that our will becomes a reality, we gain this sense of power that is absolutely addicting. Gaining control, however, rarely results in true happiness, does it? Okay, I get what you're saying here, preacher, but religious people don't get sucked into this. Power struggles and shenanigans happen as much in the church as they do outside the church, okay? Maybe this is why some people identify as spiritual but not religious. I don't know. But even among these so-called spiritual people who think that they're divorced from the church's shenanigans, how many of them have actually handed over their will to God? That is the definition of surrender, too, by the way, handing our will over to God. Jesus said, "If anyone wishes to follow me, let him renounce himself or deny themselves," whichever version you're reading. And he says this in all four Gospels, which is amazing that a phrase like that takes place in all four Gospels. Surrendering is handing your will over, letting your will go, and allowing God's will to be done. Like I said last week, let go, let God. Now, I'll tell you something that humans are really good at. We are good at coming up with substitutions for things that we don't like or that we don't agree with. We know that the path to developing a deep, healthy spiritual life involves surrender. So we come up with something that seems like surrender, but really it's not. Our favorite substitute for surrendering is heroic sacrifice. Richard Rohr calls heroic sacrifice the universal substitute for renouncing our will. Now, heroic sacrifice can almost become a religion unto itself. It's the most common way of renouncing the self, but not really renouncing the self. Heroic sacrifice gives the illusion of being loving and generous. And sacrifice can be loving and generous, but most of the time it's all about us. Okay? What it gives us, and remember, the biggest reason that we do anything is because we get something from it. The biggest thing it gives us is a sense of superiority, definition, admiration, and control. Oh, look at that person. Look at the sacrifices that they've made so that they can be so successful. How can you argue with that? But it's not the gospel. In fact, it is the very opposite of the gospel. But it's the most common substitution. Rohr believes that there's two types of love. One that sincerely seeks the spiritual good of others, and another that seeks superiority and admiration and control for itself by doing good and noble things and making heroic sacrifices. To put it in, here's the thing though, to put it in perspective, suicide bombers are sacrificial, right? That sounds sick and twisted, but that's the truth. Most resentful people are sacrificial. Controlling and manipulative parents are sacrificial. This is true even for some martyrs in the church. There's been monks throughout history who've died horrible deaths by getting people to hate them so much that they would get killed so that they could be listed among the martyrs of the church. And Richard Rohr is a Catholic priest. He's the one that said that. That's not me. That kind of sacrificial religiosity was the biggest critique that Jesus had for the Sadducees and the Pharisees in the New Testament. They were making all these sacrifices in order to look heroic and gain moral ground. But in Mark 12:38 and Luke 20:45, Jesus said, "Beware the scribes who like to go about in long robes and have salutations in the marketplaces and the best seats in the synagogues and the place of honor at feasts, who devour widows' houses and for pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." And then in Matthew 23:23, Jesus says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faith. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others." And in saying these things, he's just reflecting the message of the prophets, Amos and Hosea and Joel and Micah. In Hosea 6:6, the prophet proclaimed, "For I desire steadfast love, not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings." And then, of course, a couple of weeks ago, we already went over Micah 6:6-8, where he says, God says, "I could care less about 1,000 rams and 10,000 rivers of oil." God requires that we do only justice and love mercy and walk humbly with God. Rohr wrote that false sacrifice is an actual avoidance of any real renouncing of the self while looking generous and dedicated. So, all this to say that being religious is no substitute for developing and nurturing spirituality. God refuses to bless or reward any kind of moral worthiness game. Jesus handed down probably some of his harshest criticisms to those who insisted that it was a moral contest. Because Jesus didn't even hang out with the people who thought that they were all moral and righteous. He didn't have time for their games. He hung out with people who were prostitutes and tax collectors and drunkards and all the other sinners. Jesus overturned the tables at a temple where vendors sold animals for sacrifice. He was angry that animal sacrifice had become just another buying and selling of God's favor scheme to avoid doing the real work of surrendering. Jesus mocked people who put a lot of money in the temple treasury, but then he lifted up a poor widow who only gave 1 coin. But that was all that she had to give. And that's why Jesus lifted her up as the better example of the one who had given the most. Philosopher Rene Girard argued that Jesus came to proclaim the death of sacrificial religion and ended it, as Hebrews 10:9 says, once and for all by offering himself. But it didn't take too much longer for the church to fall back into this sacrificial pattern, because the old ego always prefers an economy of merit and sacrifice over any economy of grace or unearned love where we have no control. To put it another way, we somehow always fall back on thinking that the spiritual journey is a moral achievement contest where none of us are worthy. But there is a better way. There is a better way. There is a path to deep spirituality that transcends all this nonsense that we have cooked up simply because we can't stand the notion that somebody can receive something that they didn't earn. Ooh, right? And really, when you get down to it, when you think about it, that's what it all boils down to. We hate it when somebody receives something good that they didn't earn, right? It is downright offensive to some folks. And you know what? That's okay, because it's offensive to me sometimes. But don't tell me that you're a good Christian if you can't accept getting something for nothing, because that is the foundation of the gospel message. That is the good news of the gospel. God's grace and love is, be careful now because I'm about ready to use an offensive F word. God's grace and love is free. It is freely given. Yeah, but you just said, Pastor, that it offends you sometimes. Yes, I did say that. And overcoming that feeling of being offended is the work that I have to do in order to develop a deep Christian spirituality. It's the work that all of us have to do when we decide to follow Jesus. Richard Rohr says, we have been graced for a truly sweet surrender if we can radically accept being radically accepted for nothing. The path to deep Christian spirituality isn't about duty or obligation or requirement or heroic sacrifices. It's about learning the art of surrender.